Still getting ready. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 598, the Georgia Support Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 598, a bill to support the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Georgia and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 598.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would first like to submit in the congressional record an exchange of letters between myself and the chairs of the committees on Judiciary and Ways and Means on H.R. 598.
Without objection.
I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Connolly and Mr. Kinzinger for authoring this excellent bill. This measure comes before us at a crucial time. As President Trump takes the sledgehammer to our country's standing in the world, it falls to the Congress to uphold our relationships with our friends and partners. Strong alliances and partnerships make a stronger, safer America, and it's important for our national security to make sure that our friends can defend themselves against hostile adversaries. That's especially true for a country like Georgia, who is fighting President Putin's aggression every single day. In 2008, Russia invaded and occupied parts of Georgia, flagrantly breaking international law and violating Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And now, over a decade later, Russia hasn't let up the assault on Georgia. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, human rights violations. This is what the people of Georgia endure from Putin's regime all the time. So we must support Georgia's efforts to protect itself. The Georgia Support Act calls on the U.S. to continue to support Georgia's democratic institutions, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. It also provides critical assistance for Georgia's struggle against Russian aggression, supporting efforts to boost cybersecurity and counter Russian disinformation. And it slaps sanctions on those responsible for human rights violations in the Russian-occupied Georgian region of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We should be strengthening our relationship with Georgia and bringing it into the fold of the EU and NATO. This is a good bill that moves us in the right direction, showing that Congress stands with Georgia. I strongly support this measure, and I urge all members to join me in doing so. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 598, the Georgia Support Act. It's legislation I introduced with my colleague, Mr. Connolly. Georgia has been a strong ally to the United States, and ensuring their territorial sovereignty is essential to European security and American interests. Since the Russian invasion in 2008, Georgia has been embroiled in a battle for its very right to exist due to Putin's flagrant aggression. For over a decade, Russia has illegally occupied the Georgian parts of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which constitutes 20% of Georgia's territory. Putin has constructed military bases, erected border fences across civilian farms, and restricted transit between the occupied regions and Georgia. The subsequent occupation has displaced thousands of ethnic Georgians. Those who refuse to leave their homes now face extreme human rights abuses. Furthermore, Russia continues to meddle in Georgia's political processes and seeks to sow discord and chaos among the population. Our legislation reaffirms U.S. support for Georgia's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as well as the continued development of democratic values in Georgia. It also pushes for an increase in security assistance to Georgia, greater cybersecurity cooperation between our nations, and an enhancement of Georgia's ability to combat Russian disinformation campaigns. Most importantly, this bill authorizes the president to impose sanctions on those individuals responsible for human rights abuses in those regions. Passage of this legislation is an opportunity to show support for an ally that's been one of the greatest contributors to the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, and one that has endured Putin's belligerence for over a decade. By deepening U.S.-Georgia security cooperation, we send a strong message to Putin to think twice before interfering in Georgia again. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 4 minutes to the author of this important bill, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I want to start by saluting our distinguished chairman. Thank you so much to our chairman for bringing this bill to the floor and for managing it today. He's just returned from an arduous trip. I've been on that trip. I know how tiring it can be, and frankly, even what some personal danger one puts oneself in that trip. And I salute the chairman for his stamina and his commitment to American foreign policy being here on the floor today. So I thank him and salute him and his able staff. I also, of course, want to thank my co-chair of the Georgia Caucus and co-author of H.R. 598, the Georgia Support Act, Mr. Kinzinger, who's been a wonderful partner and always willing to look at an issue thoughtfully and put himself sometimes at political risk in showing intestinal fortitude. And we salute you too, Mr. Kinzinger. This legislation asserts the United States' continued support for the independence and sovereignty of Georgia. It supports Georgia's continued democratic development, including free and fair elections, and affirms U.S. opposition to Russian aggression in the region, which is not, as has been noted, theoretical. Russian troops occupy Abkhazia and Ossetia in Georgia. Russia has fomented unrest, aided separatist movements, and committed serious human rights violations, including ongoing detentions and killings. Russian forces continue to harass civilian communities along the administrative borderline and impede the right of the return of internally displaced persons, even moving that administrative boundary line arbitrarily. Just a few weeks ago, tensions flared over a reported buildup of military equipment and personnel near the ABL, the administrative borderline, in Russian-occupied South Ossetia. H.R. 598 bolsters Georgia's territorial integrity by authorizing sanctions against those responsible for or complicit in human rights violations in these occupied territories. As chairman of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I'm very pleased that the Georgia Support Act recognizes that Georgia has been a long-standing NATO aspirant country and a contributor to NATO's troop levels. I've traveled to Georgia 3 times in the last 3 years, including for the spring meeting of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, and I believe that Georgia is a key partner for NATO's security. This act builds on previous efforts that Congress has undertaken to support Georgia's territorial integrity. In the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, PL 115-44, we enshrined a non-recognition policy for Russia's illegal occupation of Georgian territory. In the 114th Congress, the House passed H.R. 660, which Judge Poe and I introduced to express support for Georgia's full territorial integrity. The resolution was a clear and unequivocal statement in support of sovereign territory of Georgia and reiterated the longstanding policy of the United States not to recognize territorial changes effected by force, as dictated by the Stimson Doctrine going back to 1932, authored by then Secretary of State Henry Stimson. As the House of Representatives passed the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, H.R. 596, earlier this year, the Georgia Support Act is another clear and unequivocal statement by this Congress on the issue of territorial sovereignty. This act expresses Congress's support for the vital U.S.-Georgia partnership, which is a strategically important relationship in a very critical part of the world. I urge my colleagues to adopt this legislation. And again, I thank the chairman for his distinguished leadership on this issue and my partner, Mr. Kinzinger. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague and chairman for yielding. Georgia has a long and rich history as an important U.S. partner and a key player in the region. Unfortunately, Georgia most dramatically came into the world stage with news in 2008 that Russia had invaded and occupied regions within its territory. Since that time, Russia has continued to illegally occupy the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Today, Georgia stands in the front lines of Russian aggression along with Ukraine. And it's imperative that the United States assist Georgia in its efforts to stand up against Russia, to address the humanitarian concerns in those areas, to fight against Russian disinformation, and to keep moving Georgia towards its goal of a strong and sovereign democracy. I'm proud that we're here today to continue to support the development of democratic values as well as the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Republic of Georgia. Georgia's been a strong partner and friend of the United States, and I'm proud that we're showing our support by moving this legislation forward today. I urge my colleagues to support the Georgia Support Act, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
May I inquire, do you have any more speakers, gentlemen? Okay, thank you. Mr. Speaker, in closing, again, I want to thank Mr. Connolly for his great work on this. I want to thank the chairman for bringing it to the floor and for his friendship and for the whole committees in this Congress's steadfast support for our Georgian allies. As was mentioned earlier, and it's worth renoting, Georgia, pound for pound, has the strongest commitment to NATO in Afghanistan, and they're not even full NATO members. So that tells you the kind of people they are. They're a key strategic and democratic partner in a tumultuous region, and increased U.S. support is a significant step towards countering the global threat of Russia every day. This bill passed in the 115th Congress in a bipartisan margin overwhelmingly, so I urge my colleagues to support this legislation yet again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing.
The gentleman is recognized.
This is a good, strong bipartisan bill to support Georgia as it fends off Russian aggression. I thank my Foreign Affairs Committee colleagues, Mr. Connolly and Mr. Kinzinger, for their work on this measure. If you look back at history, when the Soviet Union existed, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union and really felt the yoke of Russian aggression on their necks. When the Soviet Union broke up and Russia tried to influence all the surrounding countries, Georgia resisted with good cause, because Georgia does not want to be a part of a country that makes them subservient. So it really, to me, is so important for the United States to support Georgia. It's in a difficult neighborhood right near Russia. It faces constant threats every day. As I and my colleagues said, Russia is now occupying a large part of their territory, and it really should not be left to stand. I personally, and I've said this many times, think that the West made a mistake back in 2008 when Georgia tried to become part of NATO and was turned down. I believe that both Georgia and Ukraine should be part of NATO. I think that's very important, and I think that is part of the reason why we see such Russian aggression in both Ukraine and Georgia. So I hope all members will join us in supporting this passage. The people of Georgia need to know that the United States Congress stands with them against Putin's aggression, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 598 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 552, calling on the government of the Russian Federation to provide evidence of wrongdoing or to release United States citizen Paul Whelan.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 552, resolution calling on the government of the Russian Federation to provide evidence of wrongdoing or to release United States citizen Paul Whelan.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Resolution 552.
Without objection,
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we stand here on the House floor, an American citizen is being wrongfully held in a Russian prison without trial, without any evidence of his supposed crime, denied his rights, suffering, deprived of the medical attention he so desperately needs. This is how Vladimir Putin is treating Paul Whelan, a U.S. citizen who has been unjustly imprisoned in Russia for almost a year. There's been no evidence offered to show that Mr. Whelan has done anything wrong or anything to deserve this horrific imprisonment with no end in sight. Paul's family in Michigan wants to see him return home safely, and Congress must stand with them and demand justice. HRES 552 sends a strong message from Congress. It calls on Russia to either offer up some legitimate evidence that justifies why they have Mr. Whelan in prison, or immediately release him and let him come home to his family in the United States. We cannot accept this current situation to go on any longer. With Mr. Whelan languishing in a cell with no understanding of why he's being subjected to this horror. Sadly, this injustice is what life is like in Putin's Russia. There is no independent judicial process. There is no rights for defendants. There is abuse, mistreatment, corruption. It's critical that we all keep this in mind. That's why it's so important for the United States to stand strong in condemning Putin and upholding our commitment to the rule of law. I want to thank Ms. Stevens for her hard work in authoring this measure. As Mr. Whelan's congressional representative, she has been tirelessly pushing for Paul's release, as has the entire Michigan delegation. This is a good bipartisan measure I'm pleased to support. I urge all members to do the same, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of HRES 552, which calls on the government of the Russian Federation to release Paul Whelan, an American citizen, from their custody or provide compelling evidence of his alleged wrongdoing. On December 28, 2018, Paul Whelan traveled to Moscow to attend a friend's wedding when he was arrested on allegations of spying. Over the past 10 months, Mr. Whelan has maintained his innocence as he awaits trial, which is expected to start in January of 2020. Mr. Whelan suffers from a chronically painful medical condition which requires surgery. Unfortunately, this surgery was scheduled for shortly after his return from Moscow in January of 2019. Over the past 10 months, Mr. Whelan has been living in pain as he's declined to have the surgery in Russia. This bipartisan, bicameral resolution calls for the Russian Federation to immediately release Paul Whelan from his unwarranted detainment. Further, it calls for due process and unrestricted access to consular services for Mr. Whelan. I am proud to co-sponsor this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the author of this important resolution, the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. By bringing up my resolution today, HRES 552, we are making clear to the Russian government and President Putin that Congress will not tolerate the indefinite detention of a U.S. citizen without evidence. For nearly 10 months, my constituent, Paul Whelan of Novi, Michigan, has been held in a Moscow prison without adequate due process. Paul was detained last December and continues to be held in a horrifying prison. We have repeatedly asked the Russian government to provide Paul with a fair and transparent judicial process to no avail. The State Department has been unwavering in their work on Paul's behalf, especially Ambassador Huntsman. The Russian government has not provided timely updates about Paul's case. They have not let him select his own attorney, and they have not provided unrestricted consular access. Next week will be Paul's fourth pre-trial detention hearing. Enough is enough. After many months in prison, Paul's health is deteriorating. Paul's family is wondering. Everyone is in the dark, but most especially Paul. It is long past time that we bring Paul home to his family and get him the medical care he needs. This bipartisan resolution calls on the Russian government to provide evidence of his wrongdoing or else release Paul immediately. This is our sense of Congress. It must be our sense of Congress, for we stand up for Americans abroad. I thank my friend, Mr. Wahlberg, for joining me and for the Michigan delegation, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass this timely resolution. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Resolution 552 and call on the Russian government to provide evidence of wrongdoing or to release United States citizen Paul Whelan. I thank my colleague, Congresswoman Haley Stevens, for her untiring work on this important issue. Paul Whelan is a veteran. He's a Michigan resident who's been held in Russian captivity for nearly 10 months without charges. And I repeat, he has been held in Russian captivity for nearly 10 months without charges. Throughout his entire time, Paul has not been given due process. He has had multiple pre-trial hearings in which his detainment has repeatedly been extended without the production of any new or credible evidence. While in captivity, he's been in need of serious medical attention and his health has deteriorated. It is unacceptable for an American citizen to be detained for any length of time without charges and without proper medical care. Paul's entire family, including his parents who live in my district in Manchester, Michigan, are deeply concerned about his health and safety, as they should be. I've met with members of the Whelan family on many occasions, and they have been pillars of strength, but also have endured much agony. We stand united today, saying this is not a partisan issue. It is an American issue. As Republicans and Democrats, we are committed to raising awareness about Paul's case and advocating for his freedom. And we stand to send a strong and powerful message today by passing this resolution. I encourage my colleagues to stand together, pass this resolution, and tell Russia it is wrong as to what they're doing. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating. 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman for yielding. Nearly 10 months ago, on December 28th, 2018, the government of the Russian Federation arrested U.S. citizen Paul Whelan. In those 10 months, the Russian government has refused to provide any evidence to substantiate the espionage charges against Paul. Instead, in those 10 months, the Russian government has subjected Paul to physical and psychological pressure. In those 10 months, the Russian government has repeatedly prevented Paul from speaking freely with the U.S. Embassy or with his family, rights that are afforded to Russian prisoners here in the U.S. In those 10 months, the Russian government has denied Paul's request to be examined or treated by a private physician. And I say Russian government. I say government because I believe the Russian people, particularly those that are speaking up and demonstrating for an open and democratic government there, they would be standing with us today. For 10 months, the Russian government has refused to respond to the concerns of the governments of the United States, UK, Canada, and Ireland. For 10 months, Paul's continued detention has caused indescribable pain and torment, not only for Paul, but for his parents, his 2 brothers, and his sisters. 10 months of injustice is 10 months too long. Now, in our committee, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, we look for areas of common ground to work with Russia. But actions like this, depriving a U.S. citizen of the most basic rights, makes that all the more difficult. On behalf of Paul, on behalf of his family, I hope you will join me in supporting House Res 552 and calling on the government of Russia to allow a fair and transparent judicial process without delay, facilitate Paul's medical care, and allow for unrestricted visits with the U.S. Embassy. And above all, I hope you will all join with me in calling on the government of Russia to release Paul and send him back home to his family. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman has no further, I'm prepared to close. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to thank Mr. Whelan's family for continuing to fight for his release and for bringing this matter to our attention. He's a pawn. Russia quite clearly has a terrible track record of taking care of people, whether it's bombing hospitals in Syria intentionally or whether it's just abusing people in other parts of the world, Venezuela, or imprisoning Americans. It's obviously their track record. But I urge my colleagues to pass this with my Democratic and Republican colleagues and support this resolution. And I thank the chairman for bringing it up, the family for fighting, and everybody spoke. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to again thank Representative Stevens for her hard work on this measure. Paul Whelan, an American citizen, as my colleagues have mentioned, has been enduring mistreatment in a Russian prison without the Russian government offering up any evidence that he's done anything wrong. HRES 552 calls on the Russian government to either provide some evidence of wrongdoing to explain Mr. Whelan's imprisonment or release Mr. Whelan immediately so he can come home to the United States and receive the proper medical treatment he so urgently needs. He and his family have suffered enough as part of Putin's political games. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their strong support for this resolution. It's a good measure. I urge all members to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to Resolution 552? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chairs, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 32, expressing the sense of Congress regarding the execution-style murders of United States citizens Yili Agron and Mehmed Batici in the Republic of Serbia in July 1999.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 32, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress regarding the execution-style murders of United States citizens Yuli Agron and Mehmet Batici in the Republic of Serbia in July 1999.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H-Con Res 32.
Without objection,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Mr. Zeldin for authoring this resolution. This measure is one particularly close to my heart. I have had, in my career in Congress, I've had long dealings with the Albanian community, both in the Balkans and in America. So this one really, really hurts, since I know the family of these 3 brothers who were murdered. Yili Agron and Mehmet Batici were 3 brothers from New York State who were killed execution style by Serbia officials after they mistakenly crossed the unmarked Serbia-Kosovo border. Their bodies were discovered with their hands bound behind their backs in a mass grave in 2001. Serbian President Vučić promised me 3 years ago that his government would bring the murderers to justice, but this hasn't happened. In fact, there isn't even a serious criminal investigation underway. This is appalling, and sadly, it's part of a pattern we see with Serbian war criminals responsible for crimes against the people of Kosovo. The Batici brothers are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to post-conflict justice in Serbia. And we had a hearing on the Foreign Affairs Committee several weeks ago about this very topic. Approaching 3 years ago, the Belgrade-based Humanitarian Law Center released a dossier detailing the murder of nearly 1,000 Kosovars killed by Serbs in Kosovo, then transported to Serbia and dumped in a mass grave. The U.S. government has raised this atrocity with the Serbian war crimes prosecutor, but once again, no one has been held accountable, although I believe with all my heart Serbian authorities know who is responsible for this. Let's be clear. If Serbia wants to join the West and its institutions, they must deal with their past and prosecute those responsible for war crimes. I encourage our EU friends to hold Serbia to this standard when considering Serbia's candidacy. Today's resolution makes it clear that Serbia must fully investigate the Batici brothers' case and bring justice to the families of these murdered New Yorkers. Their family currently lives in New York in Mr. Zeldin's district. It also calls on the U.S. government to encourage and assist a successful prosecution of this case. So I strongly support this measure, and again want to thank Mr. Zeldin for his excellent work and partnership with me in trying to push the Serbian government to find justice for these New Yorkers. I urge all members to support this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H-Con Res 32. I wish to start off by thanking the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel for his long time passion and advocacy on this very important issue for my district, as well as Grace Meng, who also has been supportive. Now, this execution-style murder of Yili, 25 years old, Agron, 23 years old, and Mehmet Batici, 21 years old, has greatly impacted my own district. These were three brothers born in the United States, resided in Hampton Bays, New York. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Batici brothers' murder. In July of 1999, these three brothers went overseas towards the end of the Kosovo War and were arrested by Serbian authorities for illegally entering the country when they accidentally crossed into Serbian-controlled territory. The brothers were kidnapped, murdered, and dumped into a mass grave in Serbia by government officials still serving today. Since taking office, I've been committed to helping the Batici family receive the justice they have long deserved. In February, Chairman Engel and I traveled to Munich to meet with Serbian President Vučić, where he once again promised to resolve the case of the Batici brothers. Despite many promises by Serbian officials to resolve the case of this state-sponsored murder, there has been no justice served. This resolution notes that progress with this investigation should remain a significant factor which determines the further developments of U.S.-Serbian relations. The Batici brothers gave their lives to fight injustice. Now we must return this favor and deliver justice for their family. I'd like to again thank Chairman Engel and lead Republican McCall for their leadership and assistance on this issue. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I have no other speakers prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Once again, I encourage all of my colleagues to support this important resolution. And for those in Serbia listening to today's floor debate, it's an important lesson 20 years later that we have not forgotten, we will not forget. We will continue to strongly encourage them to do the right thing. This issue is not going away if they wish it away. On a bipartisan basis, we will continue to advocate to fight this injustice. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules? New York is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing.
The gentleman is recognized.
This is a good measure to seek justice for the senseless murder of three innocent American citizens, three innocent New Yorkers. We cannot allow this horrific crime to continue to go unpunished. As Mr. Zeldin mentioned, and others that we've worked with, we have raised this repeatedly with the government of Serbia to no avail. They know exactly who killed these American citizens. They know what happened and why the bodies were dumped in a mass grave. They are withholding it, and it is unconscionable that these American citizens cannot get justice, their families cannot get justice, and we will not stop. I know Mr. Zeldin and I won't, and other people won't, until we get justice and we get answers as to who killed the American citizens, the Batici brothers, who were born in the United States of America. So I hope all members will join me in supporting this resolution. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 32? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.